Good morning. In our preaching, we tend to look at the suffering side of this life, and for good reason, because there are many things in this life, many trials and travails that we face, whether it's health difficulties or the loss of family members, tragic things that happen in our community, or an economic disaster of some kind that either comes upon our nation or upon us as individuals and families. So it's for good reason that Alan and I spend a lot of time talking about suffering and what it means and how the Christian should deal with it and handle it and approach it. But we have to provide some balance in our preaching as well. And I have found, at least in my life, that I am just as likely to fall away from God, to sin, to become self-dependent or arrogant in times of good as in times that are bad. So this morning what I want to talk about is how to handle some of the good times, or how one might handle a promotion. Because normally we think of our challenges as coming from the negative events in our lives, such as financial deprivation. But how often do we realize that it is sometimes our physical or material blessings that bring us the difficulties that we need to overcome? Many of us have experienced the thrill of moving up in the world, and surely many more have aspirations that include a promotion or a pay raise or a new house or a new car or something along those lines. But remember, the boon in your life has two sides. With every promotion comes increased danger of greed and the temptation to lose sight of your spiritual priorities, and even the possibility that we become so increasingly superficial that we forget to include God in our lives at all. So to help us think about the subject of how to handle a promotion, or more generally speaking, how to handle the good times in life, let's go to the book of Nehemiah. And you're thinking, well, how does the story of Nehemiah at all have anything to do with handling the good times? Go to chapter 5. Now, up to this point in the story of Nehemiah, the man has faced incredible challenges. Nehemiah faced a challenge from the very get-go of asking the emperor's permission to even go to Jerusalem and rebuild the walls. And once he got there, he faced the challenge of the discouragement of the people in Jerusalem. He faced enemies like Sanballat and Tobiah. He faced schemes on their part and the allies that they collected for themselves in trying to bring about the end of the work that was being done in the city of Jerusalem and rebuilding its walls. But in chapter 5, Nehemiah gives us some indication that not everything was bad for him all the time. In fact, his life as governor in Judea was a life that was quite blessed, materially speaking. And that blessed material life came with temptations that he had to deal with. So let's begin in Nehemiah chapter 5 and in verse 14, where Nehemiah writes of his experiences. Moreover, from the day that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, for 12 years, neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance. Think about this. Nehemiah was a man who went from being the king's personal cupbearer, which is no small or unimportant task itself, to being governor of the region of Judah. Remember also that for years the land had been stricken with poverty, hunger, and political corruption. Judah was one of Babylon's most extreme and remote provinces. So it was very easy then for the governors and the rulers in Judah to get away with a little bit more corruption than might have been tolerated closer to the capital. So when Nehemiah stepped into the role as governor of this area, it was perhaps expected in some quarters, expected in some people's minds, that he would, right along with his predecessors, take full advantage of the things that were offered to him. And yet here he is saying in verse 14, neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance. Something that was there for us legally, something that all of our predecessors took advantage of to the fullest, we denied. We did not involve ourselves in that. Now, I think a good practical application is this, that when you do get a raise when you do get a promotion, when you do move up in the world as Nehemiah just did, don't be too quick to take full advantage of all of the opportunities that come along with that. Think about the impression that it might leave on your boss. The day that you get promoted, and the first question you ask is, so what's the limit on discretionary spending with this job? So how often do I get to borrow the company car? Now, I understand that anytime you're in an interview for a new job or a promotion or something like that, there's certainly nothing wrong with showing an interest in the perks or the benefits that come along with that job. You want to know what those things are before you get the job, obviously. You want to know what the salary is and what the health benefits are. But be really careful not to seem too eager about things like that, because it certainly leaves an impression both on your boss as well as all of the people who are going to be working underneath you at this point. Nehemiah could have been just like every other governor who came before him, and the people would have expected, they would not have been surprised by it. But that's not who Nehemiah is. And that's certainly not the impression that he wanted to leave on people. Nehemiah had a saintly character that understood the power and the value of self-limitation. That just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. His first responsibility was not to his own desires, but to the people under his charge. And great leaders always are willing to sacrifice their own privileges for the benefit of their followers. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 23, and in chapter 6 and verse 12. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. And remember, that's in the context surrounding chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians, where Paul the Apostle explains all the reasons why he was unwilling to take a salary from the church in Corinth, because he wanted to leave an impression on them. Because he understood, at least as the way he described it in chapter 8, verses 14 through 18, that when you make sacrifices for other people in your actions and in your attitudes, that is what can change somebody, and that is what can leave the greatest impression on a person. What we honor most about good leaders is their adherence to a powerful concept in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 24. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. And that's Nehemiah. In verse 15 of our text, but the governors who were before me laid many burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine besides the 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants domineered the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of the Lord. One of the temptations that we face when we assume a new position at work or in the community is to let precedent rule our decisions. That everybody else did it a certain way before me, so that makes it okay for me to continue in their footsteps and do it the exact same way myself. The problem is that we allow the mistakes of the past to dictate our actions today, and we cannot allow that to happen. We cannot allow that to happen. Sometimes when we either take a new job or we're promoted or we slip into the same kind of mistakes that our predecessors made, we might reinforce the bad blood between people or the preconceptions that people have about certain ones in our authority or in our positions. Teenagers, for example. Here's a good practical application. Teenagers are often seen as lazy or sloppy, especially in their work. I think we all have had an experience like that, if I can go ahead and level with you. When you're going through the drive-thru at the Taco Bell and Sally's summer job is taking your order and you know, you get done with putting your order and you roll up your window and you look at your wife and go, we're not going to get the food that we ordered. We did that last Sunday, actually. I looked at her and I said, oh, we're not getting the food that we ordered. That ain't going to happen. But you know how it is. And so we have this idea in our minds that teenagers make this kind of employee. That teenagers must always be kind of sloppy and lazy. They never tuck their shirts in. They show up to work late. They will take full advantage of whatever they're allowed to take during their lunch break. If you're allowed to order this much food and it comes, Well, here's my challenge to the teenagers here. Why don't you rise above the mistakes of the people who came before you? Do better than them. Give your boss at Taco Bell or wherever it is that you work for your summer job, give your boss a reason to think that there is some hope for the future in this country. You don't have to fall into the same role that your predecessors set for you. You don't just have to be the next person who fills a role like that. You don't have to be the next person who just further establishes and entrenches a stereotype in people's thinking. I like this phrase here in verse 15, even their servants domineered the people. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the moochers that surround athletes and celebrities. People who are, in their own right, totally unimportant. But because of their association with LeBron James or somebody else, they become important people. Not because they've done anything, not because they've earned it, not because they personally have any kind of skill that they've cultivated, but because they're moochers. Because they've latched on to somebody more important and more talented than them, and they're just along for the ride. Even their servants domineered the people. Even their servants domineered the people. We need to remember that as we move up in the world and as prosperity becomes more realistic for us as we get older and more experienced in the workforce, the likelihood of finding the moochers out there, the likelihood of finding these kinds of people increases. Watch out. Watch out for the people who only want to be your friends because of the advantage that might come along with it. Be very careful and wary of people like that. Because many wealthy people fail to take responsibility for their entourage. Verse 16. And I also applied myself to the work on the wall. We did not buy any land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. What a contrast it is. All of the other governors, all of his predecessors, they had their moochers, they had their Klingons, they had their servants who were domineering, who would not do any work but took advantage of their position. And here's Nehemiah saying, all we did was work. And my servants were there to work. My servants weren't there for fringe benefits. My servants were there to work. All of us applied our hands to the work that was set before us. One of the ways that we can avoid the trap of vanity in our life is to keep our motivation aligned properly. Nehemiah didn't become governor for the perks. Nehemiah became governor because he was the man for the job. Because he knew it was a difficult job that needed to be done by somebody. Somebody had to care about the welfare of Jerusalem. Somebody had to take some interest in God's holy city, the seat of David, the place of Israel's glory for so many generations. And up to this point, nobody had. Nobody had. And Tobiah and Sanballat and Geshem, they were on the sidelines laughing at Jerusalem's lack of prosperity. Laughing at the hard times that had come upon the people of God because of their sins. When we're faced with a job that does include some kind of fringe benefits, we need to be really careful not to lose sight of the actual mission of that job. Some people become so enamored with the perks that they forget about the responsibilities for which they were originally assigned to that task. Nehemiah's first priority was rebuilding the wall. Not buying land, not building his own personal business or his own personal empire, but rebuilding the wall in Jerusalem so that everybody in that city could benefit, so that everybody's lives were made just a little bit better by the sense of security and the peace of mind of having a stone wall surrounding your home and your marketplace and your business and your family. That was his first priority. My suggestion is this. If you're struggling with motivation in your job, maybe you've lost the passion that you had when you first set out on this professional journey. Maybe you're not applying yourself the way that Nehemiah is. My suggestion to you is try to go back to the original reason why you took a job. The original reason why you started going down that career path in the first place. Every job is a job. Let's make sure we understand that. Every job is a job. And I might love my job, but my job is still a job. There are days where my job is hard. There are days where your job is hard. But on the hard days, when we're having a hard time, when we're struggling with why we're doing it, we need to go back to 10 years ago, to 20 years ago. We need to go back to when we first had an interest or a zeal or a purpose or a reason for starting that job in the first place. Now here's the thing. Maybe you do work at a job that doesn't really thrill your soul. Maybe you don't. Some people have to stock shelves. Shelves need to be stocked. Things need to be made. Things need to be built. Numbers need to be crunched. And maybe that's just a job to you, and that's okay. Guess what? There's almost nobody on planet Earth who gets to just sit around strumming the guitar all day long for a living. There's almost nobody on planet Earth who just gets to finger paint all day and get paid to do it. Most people on planet Earth work a job because it's a job, and they need to work. So maybe your job doesn't thrill you. But I'm always reminded of what Paul wrote to the Colossians. In Colossians chapter 3, that whatever you do, whatever job it is that you do, even if it's a job that you hate, even if it's menial labor, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. Now, Nehemiah's job was not a menial job. This was a very important job that could have come along with a lot of fringe benefits. But was he doing it for himself? Or was he working heartily as for the Lord? Maybe the reason why you took a certain job was because you needed a paycheck to take care of your family. And maybe you hate your job. Maybe you hate everything about it. But I think your family appreciates having a roof over their head. And that job makes it possible for you to take care of your family. And if for no other reason than that, appreciate your job. Work for God. Work for your family. Work for a higher cause. And you might not like your job, but you'll find purpose in it. You will find purpose in it. If your purpose goes beyond simply living from day to day to day. All my servants were gathered there for the work, Nehemiah says. Because he was there for the right reasons, Nehemiah attracted a certain kind of crowd to himself. The right kind of people were attracted, were drawn to Nehemiah because he was there for the right reasons, then his servants were there for the right reasons. You want to strive to be that kind of person in everything that you do, whether it's work or family or in your relationships with other Christians and in your service to God. Be there for the right reasons, and you will draw other people in for the right reasons as well. Honest, earnest people will naturally surround themselves with people of equal character. Verses 17 and 18. Moreover, there were at my table 150 Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now that which was prepared for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also birds were prepared for me, and once in 10 days all sorts of wine were furnished in abundance. Yet for all of this I did not demand the governor's food allowance, because the servitude was heavy on this people. I love that Nehemiah is honest enough to clarify his own personal expenditures. Now, if this seems like a lot to you, if you're thinking, well, boy, it sure didn't sound like he was living within his means here, understand that when you have 150 Jews and officials, besides all of the people who attach themselves to Nehemiah from other nations, that's a lot of people that you're taking care of. This is not Nehemiah saying that we lived lavishly. This is not him gloating about the way that he lived. This is Nehemiah saying, this is what it takes to feed an army. And I give Nehemiah a ton of credit for being honest about it. That for anybody who thought Nehemiah was living in the lap of luxury, for anybody who had the wrong impression about him, or who wanted to take his personal expenditures and use it against him, here's Nehemiah opening his book, opening his records and saying, I have nothing to hide from you people. I have nothing to hide. I have not eaten a single morsel of food that I will not give an account for to you. This is what we eat in my household. I am taking care of 150 people who have important jobs in this household. 150 people who are serving in a religious or a civic capacity for the people of Jerusalem. And this is what it takes to feed 150 plus people. And I'm honest with you. But wouldn't that be nice to find that in our government today? Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice if everybody was an open book and everybody was willing to say, this is me. I'm hiding nothing and I have nothing to hide from you. And yet when we have a budget in our country, a federal budget that's like this thick, I certainly don't have time to read it. And you sometimes wonder about like the $10,000 toilet seats or something. But here's Nehemiah being honest. This is what your governor spends to take care of his people. These people, by the way, seem like they're the opposite of the moochers that we talked about earlier, because Nehemiah expected his associates to work. These weren't people who were just there for a free meal. These were people who were working and were taken care of because they were working. Very similar to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, the apostle says of those who would not work, if anyone will not work, neither let him eat. And Nehemiah, I believe, was practicing that very age-old concept. Also to point out, those who came to us from the nations, that's a really striking phrase because it illustrates the way that Nehemiah's leadership attracted all kinds of people to him, including non-Hebrews, non-Jews. Even those who had no ethnic stake in what was happening to Jerusalem, even the non-Jews, people from the nations, who again, they have no heritage in Jerusalem. There is no ethnic pride that they have. There is no association or affiliation with the Jews that should lead them somehow to work in the city of Jerusalem or affiliate themselves with Nehemiah. But even those people wanted to be a part of the work that was happening there. Because Nehemiah was the kind of leader who inspired others. He led by example. And in the way that he would hold a sword or a hammer and pick up stones, other people, even those who were not Jews, wanted to be a part of the work that was going on there. Now let's finish up here in verse 19. Remember me, he says, O my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. If only all of us handled promotions and blessings as responsibly as Nehemiah did. Now I want to reiterate something. Not everybody today, right here, is going through a good time, and I understand that. There's nothing in this lesson that's supposed to be insensitive to the situation that you're in right now. But like I said at the beginning, we preach about suffering because this is a life of suffering. This is a life of pain. And all of us at some point are going to face economic hardships of some kind. All of us at some point are going to face health difficulties and challenges. All of us at some point have to face the death of a close family member, our friends. All of us at some point will suffer. It is inevitable. But life is peaks and valleys. So we should not fall for the temptation that sin can only touch us when we're in the valley. That sin can only touch us when life is bad. No. Satan's more clever than that. Satan doesn't just touch you when you have no money in your bank account. Satan's going to touch your life when you have plenty in the bank. He isn't going to try and destroy you just when you're old or feeble or sick. But he'll try to tear you down when you're young and healthy and vigorous. Nehemiah was tempted. He was given a great big promotion to go from cupbearer Again, no small job itself, to the governor of an entire province. And he had plenty of opportunities to take advantage of the people around him. But he used his promotion for good. This was a time of plenty for Nehemiah, where he had more than enough food for himself and the people around him, and he could have had more if he wanted to. But Nehemiah showed that he had character in the good times as well as the bad. The same Nehemiah that you see fighting for the people, the same Nehemiah that you see confronting Sanballat and Tobiah fiercely, is the same Nehemiah that you meet in a comfortable governor's mansion. This humble and holy man accepted a job, and he worked at it with all of his heart. And he may have moved up in the world, but he never moved up in his own estimation. So no matter how rich we get, or how powerful, or prestigious, or famous, let us never forget that the one who measures us and judges us is God. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 1 says, "Let a man regard us in this manner, as servants and stewards, for the one who examines me is the Lord." Now, if you're not a Christian here this morning, you really ought to be. The greatest blessing that you could ever have is the spiritual blessing of being born again in Jesus Christ. You must believe that He is the Son of God. Be willing to confess that belief before others, to repent of your sins, to vow to move forward with life, and to be baptized into the body of Christ for the remission of all of your past sins. So whatever needs you might have, please come forward as we stand and sing.